Good evening, everyone. We're so happy you're here. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this virtual event with Jewell Parker Rhodes and Samira Ahmed. My name is Carell Centers, and I'm the events director here at Bookshop Santa Cruz, where I'm broadcasting live. And tonight we get to learn from two best-selling authors and staff favorites here in the store as we celebrate the release of Jewell Parker Rhodes' Paradise on Fire and Samira Ahmed's Amira and Hamza. And I'm so excited for this conversation. I have a lot of questions for both of them, and we'll get to have some of your questions as well. Before we get started, I'm just going to run through how Crowdcast works really quick so everyone can navigate comfortably tonight. I do want to mention that in order to keep this event secure, safe, and meaningful for all of us, we do exercise a zero tolerance policy for harassment of any kind. Shouldn't have to say that, but we do. So just so you know, any violations will just go ahead and remove you from the event. This event is being recorded so that you can rewatch it and you can share it with others. If you have to leave early, you can come on back to catch the end of the conversation. To the right side of your screen, there's a chat window where you can engage with what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and you can communicate any kind of tech issues you're having. I'm happy to help you out there as soon as I can. For audience questions that you'd like to ask Jewell and Samira tonight, you can ask those in the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. You can submit those at any point as the talk is underway. You can also view and upvote other questions. I do want to point out the Buy the Books button underneath the screen. And your purchase is so important, such a critical part of these events. It supports local jobs and independent culture, and it also shows the publisher that our audience here in Santa Cruz is invested and engaged in our events. So thank you so much for your purchase. You can also donate if you would like to our events program. There's a tab there for that as well. And we're working on continuing our very expansive programming into new areas. So we appreciate your donations. Thank you so much. We also have a couple of other events I'd love to mention quickly for some various age kids that we have coming up. Gary Paulsen will be here on Thursday, October 7th. We love him. I'm sure you guys do too. We'd love to have you join us on Thursday, October 7th for Gary Paulsen. We also have Ruta Cepetis on Wednesday, October 13th, who will be here as part of a panel event as well for her new graphic novel. So we hope to see you back at some of those events. I'll put some links in the chat for a complete calendar. But now on to the main attraction. Dr. Jewell Parker Rhodes is the author of Ninth Ward, which is the winner of a Coretta Scott King Honor, Sugar, winner of the Jane Addams Children's Book Award, and the New York Times bestselling Ghost Boys, as well as Bayou Magic, Towers Falling, Black Brother, and Paradise on Fire, which we are celebrating today. She has also written many award-winning novels for adults, including Magic City, a novel about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Jewell is the Virginia G. Piper Endowed Chair of Creative Writing at Arizona State University, and she joins us from Seattle tonight. And we are lucky enough to also be joined by Samira Ahmed, who, like I said, is a staff favorite as well here in the store. Samira is the best-selling author of Love, Hate, and Other Filters, Internment, Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know, and just published yesterday her first middle grade book, Amira and Hamza, The War to Save the Worlds. Samira's poetry, essays, and short stories have appeared in numerous publications and anthologies, including the New York Times, Take the Mic, Color Outside the Lines, Vampires Never Get Old, and A Universe of Wishes. She was born in Bombay, India, and has lived in New York, Chicago, and Kauai, where she spent a year searching for the perfect mango. Definitely going to ask you if you found it. And she currently resides in the Midwest. We're so grateful to have these two incredible authors with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So we're going to start off with some questions that I have for both of you, and then we'll move into hearing about your books individually a little bit. So I'm so excited to learn more about your work. And I'd love to first hear about, both of you, you write about kids that are dealing with larger than life issues. And in some ways, they're trying to save the world, which is, that's true for adults too, I think, but it's, a big task for children. And that can be in a contemporary or a fantasy setting. And I'm wondering, why did you gravitate towards that? And why do you think that's important to show as a writer?
Samira, you want to go first?
I was going to just say you should go first because you have more experience.
No, I'm happy to.
I feel like you kind of defined this. I mean, this occurs in so many of your books, and I just love how you portray it with just such humanity and love.
Well, you're very sweet, and I do appreciate that. I actually think that I got started on this idea of hardship and disaster because of the way in which, how I lived my life. That as a child, I had a really hard background and was very lonely and had to overcome a lot of trauma in order to seek out an education. And then I didn't even know that Black people wrote books until I was a junior in college. And then it was like, yes, I found my calling. But I always knew that I wanted to write for youth, but I did not think I was good enough. So that was why I wrote all those books for adults trying to become good enough. Okay, this was a long answer. But actually, the day that Hurricane Katrina hit, I had an adult novel about New Orleans published that day. And my publisher then, crazily enough, sent me to New Orleans 2 weeks later, and I saw the devastation. And I immediately just thought, what about the children? What about the animals? And that then set me on this path because as I was writing Ninth Ward about Hurricane Katrina and the levees breaking, they had the BP oil spill. So then I had to write about that in Bayou Magic. And then I have an editor saying, well, why don't you write about 9/11? And then Alvina Ling at Little Brown saying, why don't you write about social justice and young kids dying? And it's like, oh my word, and all of a sudden, I think I had this sensibility that my life, as hard as it had this mantra that I would get through, that I felt such great love from my grandmother. And grandmother would tell me, that it will get better, it will get better, it will get better. So I've lived long enough through a lot of different things and my own sort of natural disaster and earthquake. And what I want to do is empower kids and letting them know that they have the street smarts, the spiritual smarts, the resilience, to make it through, that they just have to keep working at the problem, that they have to feel empowered and love themselves. So I think that's really, in a weird kind of way, the key to how I found happiness in my own life. And I'm shining a mirror to other kids who might need that sense of, yes, I can do this. I am filled with self-confidence and self-compassion. And though there are problems, they too will pass or be solved, or I'll just simply overcome.
That's beautiful.
Wow. I love that. I know it just is very, it's like you're putting hope on the page. And I think that's just, I love that. And it's something that I try to do. And I think I was a high school teacher. And so I definitely, I taught high school for 7 years. And I think that was partially what inspired my very first book, Love, Hate, and Other Filters. Plus that combined with some of my own experiences living in New York City right after 9/11. And then also having my very first experience of Islamophobia when I was just a kid, like 7 or 8 years old, around the time of the Iran hostage crisis. And when I started thinking that I was going to write, I'm fascinated by young people, right? Because I was teaching high school and I have taught every grade from 5th grade through 12th grade. And I'm just amazed at how young people navigate the world and shape their politics and how, how their curiosity also shapes, their worldview. And I really wanted to, with my first book, I really was trying to capture this moment in childhood when life is shattered. When kids are confronted with something for which they can have no preparation, because as a very young kid, my first experience with Islamophobia was these grown men like yelling very hateful things at me. And when you're young, sometimes it doesn't quite like compute what is happening exactly in that moment, but young people always try to understand the world with the tools that they have. And no matter how well you're prepared, no matter how much someone tells you, like maybe you're going to be confronted with, this kind of bigotry or this kind of hatred or this kind of thing. And here's what you can do to a bully. And here's how to stand up for yourself. And here's how, to try to build yourself up. Sometimes in those moments, it's just so hard and you don't know what to do. And then you have to grapple with what's happened to you, and you figure out a way to confront it in your life, or confront that person or that situation. And I just find that to be such an interesting space to write about, and to write in. And I just really believe in the power of young people. And I think that speaks to like why I write about some of these difficult topics too, because kids are so often, our young people are forced to deal with terrible situations because of completely unfair and horrible choices that the adults around them are making.
I definitely think that adults could learn a lot from children. And I think sometimes when I'm writing, I'm hoping that kids will remember my book, because I always tell them, you are wonderful and glorious just as you are. So don't lose your empathy, don't lose your open-heartedness, hang on to it. And I tell them very often that after 9/11, I feel as though adults got scared. And we've gotten even more fearful over the last 20 years. And that's why we have such partisanship and such, sort of blatant injustices going on. So I say, I want you to be strong enough so that when you become an adult, you'll remember your 5th grade self or your 10th grade self, and you won't feel the need to scapegoat anybody else to make you feel better, But Samira, I gotta say, that explains why you can write high school students, YA, and middle grade. I am so in awe of writers who have that flexibility. And I can't write YA, I think, to save my life. The voice just doesn't work for me. And I think that I'm just sort of stuck in this moment of, and I love it, I absolutely love it, of that middle grade, that transitional moment when you can see the baby face and see the cusp of the adult face. And so for me, that's what's most interesting.
Well, I'm new to middle grade, but I really love it because of what you're saying, because I think it's such this amazing age of where there's still a kind of whimsical quality to the world. There's a wonder in your eyes. You're just driven by so much curiosity. You're not quite jaded yet, even though you might have a little bit of snarkiness, like maybe because of your sibling or something else. And I do think it's fascinating because, young people, middle grade students can feel so almost mature at times, and they have, the way they speak and how they can use a language. But then other times you just see them and they're, I just want to hold my stuffy and I'm not quite ready to give up that little bit of childhood yet. And it's that, I think those interstitial spaces are so interesting.
Absolutely. And when you were talking earlier about why, you were writing and what interested you, you were talking, more about, heavier themes of when, the world is shattered. And that happens differently from middle grade. And I must say you do that so well, that from your YA to middle grade, you adapt beautifully. And it's perhaps a lighter, fantastical, magical touch in your newest middle grade and first middle grade novel, but it just soars. And it's sort of like the foundation for how people should not be prejudiced, either regarding, gender or religion or anything. And you get from those young kids, those pearls of wisdom of how to be in the world. I just adored it.
Oh, thanks so much. I mean, I think when you said that sometimes adults can learn things, or we should be open-minded to learn things from kids, I think that's just so pinpoint accurate because, and I tried to put a little bit in the book of that because sometimes the kids think, why are adults behaving this way? Yes. This doesn't make sense. And you can see that in the real world too. I mean, just when we see right now, so many of our young people, even and not just high school kids, like 5th grade, 6th grade, yes. Just responding to so many crises around us, whether it's the climate crises, it was COVID. There was in my neighborhood, when there was in the beginning, there was a mask shortage. There was a young 6th grade boy whose mom had a lot of, I guess, loved to sew and had a lot of fabric. And so he took it on himself to learn how to sew masks and was distributing them at like retirement homes because there was a mask shortage. And I thought, this is just a kid in 6th grade who took it on himself to do this.
That is so beautiful.
And then he recruited other kids. And I just thought, my goodness, just this kid, these small actions can really change the world. And I think, and a lot of times in middle grade stories, that's what we see. Like, you are so important and to our world, and just this small thing that you're doing is making a difference in someone's life. And I think, that's something that you talk about when you're saying like the way world is shattered is like different in middle grade, but then you can see how young people can also make such an incredible contribution.
Yes, absolutely. I always tell the kids, I can't wait for you to grow up. And I like to remind them, in a few short years, you're going to be ruling the world. You'll be 18, eligible to vote, eligible to serve in our nation's, military, able to go to college, marry, whatever your choice or path may be. So, hey, that's why we want you to be critical thinkers. That's why we want you to read and have empathy, because you are going to rule the world. And I think we don't say that enough to kids, that a lot of adults patronize them. So it's good to know that, as writers, that you and I are really sort of echoing the same thing, because I think all of us need to shout it over and over to kids. You should feel empowered, and one day the power and the decisions will be yours.
Right. And that's why it's such an honor to write for kids. I mean, when you said, I felt like I wasn't good enough to write for kids, so I wrote for adults first. I really love that, because I feel as an adult, and partially maybe it's because I'm a teacher too, but I feel both privileged and honored to write for kids. And I also feel like I have, this maybe is the wrong, I feel like almost an ethical obligation to say some of those things that you're talking about, which is to tell kids how important they are and how much their voice matters, and how I want them to hold on to so many of those wonderful things that they have as young people, so they can carry them on into adulthood.
Absolutely.
What do you two, this makes me wonder, what do you two think it is about fiction specifically that can be so empowering for kids, especially when there's such a bombardment of really scary stuff right now, especially around obviously the pandemic that we're living through, and things like climate change and police brutality and racism that is becoming more of a thing that the white community is recognizing it really happens. What is it about fiction that can be so empowering for kids?
I think there are several studies that you can seek out that document that fiction does in fact make an enormous difference. That fiction can be superior to nonfiction or a lecture in a classroom. And I think it's because if Samira and I have done our jobs right, we have created characters that our readers can connect with, and that they can immerse in sort of almost kind of mind and heart and spiritual meld together and go through that journey. So in an odd way, imagination makes it an experiential experience, so when they finish the book, they feel as though they too have been on that quest, and that makes a lot of difference. Also, I believe that art itself serves as a catalyst for strong emotions. And as an artist, that I'm also aware of taking pain and tragedy, like the murder of, 14-year-old and 12-year-old kids, and turning that into art, which means turning that tragedy into something that's at least bite-sized, manageable, but also becomes an affirmation for humanity and what it means to be human. And then what characters, readers by default can do to help make the world better. So in that sense, I'm trying to imbue power. So it's an imaginative act that I think is unlike anything else, that it's not like a movie gives it more to you and you become more, I think there are walls, but I find theater and fiction those walls break down and you can actually be lost in the story and become one with the story, feel as though it's also your story, be empowered by it, particularly if the artist writing it is writing it with the grace, the consideration for the power of youth and young people, and that we know that we're building a legacy, that we know that we're bearing witness, that we're trying to speak a truth to power. It might not always be a literal truth, but I'm always trying to write about emotional truths. And I think that has a resonance for kids.
Yeah, that's just brilliant. So that is, I mean, I think, you know, when I was doing my master's in education, so I was training to be a teacher, my mentor assigned this very simple essay to all of the grad students, and it was just, why do we teach English literature? Why are you going to be an English teacher? Why? You know, all of us were here ready to do that. And, you know, why, it's essentially getting to this idea of like, why teach books? Why do we do that? And I remember, you know, realizing how, I think D.H. Lawrence is the one who said the novel is the most subtle form of human interrelatedness that man has ever created. And to me, that interrelatedness is just so important. And that's what I think, Jewell, that's what you're saying, which is, more than nonfiction, it's opening this space. It allows us to have this imaginative experience, and it allows me to relate to someone and then also back to myself. So there's like this kind of liminal space where I might be able to touch a story or a person's experience that's completely different from my own. That could be someone I've never met, or a kind of person I've never come across. And yet, in their experience, I can find a piece of myself.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's that interrelatedness that I think is so important. You know, I had this teacher in like Southern Illinois, it was like rural Illinois, and she said, and I thought this was pretty brave of her to do. She's a white teacher, all white rural students in a very conservative district. And she said, I'm teaching internment in my class to this, and I was like, wow, I can't believe it hasn't been banned. But she was like, amazingly, they approved it. And she said that none of the kids in her class had ever met a Muslim before.
Wow.
And there's no Muslims. I mean, it's a small rural town. There's, you know, and their only understanding of a Muslim is some of the things that they're seeing on TV. And most of those are really terrible stereotypes.
Yes.
And she said that it was an incredible experience because the kids were like, wait, what's happening to the character is really bad. It's wrong. It's not fair. And I was just very moved that she even chose the book to bring to that group. And she said that for her, it was an experience to just literally watch her students sort of making connections beyond their small community was so important to her. And that's when you realize, like I was saying before, how lucky we are to write for kids and how important that is. And
yes, I also want to interject how lucky we are to be writing right now. That the We Need Diverse Books movement has increased, you know, access for a lot of different writers. Publishers are far more open. Having had a career that goes back, you know, 40 years, I remember the gatekeepers. I have the letters where, you know, people said, oh, Black people don't read books, so therefore we can't publish you. I have the time that I wrote Magic City about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and I got, you know, hate mail from the Ku Klux Klan, and the book was really quickly remaindered, and it took another like 30 years for them to reissue it and to recognize that this was a topic to write about. So I have felt in the young youth space a kind of reopening or reawakening or something that's just magical, because look at us, writing the stories that we write, that writing about unique but universal differences among people, and trying to educate people to live in a more non-biased, non-judgmental, non-stereotype thinking way. That was not true when I was growing up, and I never read anybody who, a person of color who wrote a book until I was a junior in college. I didn't even know that there were global writers, or that you could come from India and come to America and write stories. That my upbringing was so Dick and James, so whitewashed in its text, that literally I almost lost myself. So we should be very proud of what we're doing and what the Bookshop Santa Cruz is doing right now by hosting a wide audience to have access to writers, who don't fit that usual conservative white mold way back then.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a pretty incredible time, but I mean, I just have to make sure that everyone understands that it's because of Jewell and other people who were like really paving the way that I get to walk on this path. And so that's totally, it's the truth, because, when we say we make the road by walking, Jewell was the person who was making that road by walking on it.
Well, you're very, very sweet. And actually, people walked it for me, but it is one thing I think in terms of writing art for youth that we're saying, just because you're very different, whatever your gender identity is, whatever your religious identity, cultural identity, whatever, you should, be proud of yourself, and you should know that you are loved, and you should, have compassion and grace for yourself. That message needs to be said over and over and over again for everybody. And when we all start believing in our own glory, we won't feel that need to step on anybody else. It took me a decade of overcoming stereotypes to give myself permission to say, yes, I can do this. So now that there are so many other voices, I am beyond thrilled, because that means they're helping to make a world where kids don't grow up the way that I grew up, And I got to do a shout out to Jason Reynolds, because he's going to start a new tour as national ambassador. And in particular, he's going to be going to rural communities. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, whoa, light the way and educate. And we're all just trying to make a difference.
That's so great. And to think about, the places where maybe they don't have author visits, or maybe they don't see someone, like a dark-skinned Black man who's writing amazing books, in rural farming country. That takes a level of bravery on his part too, because kids can be, I love children, but they can also be scary. So I would imagine that it kind of goes both ways in exposing, that brilliance to those kids. And just what Jewell has been talking about with sorry, Samira, you were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say that, one thing that's really interesting, when I was living in New York, I was working in an education nonprofit, and to try to get better funding for property poor school districts. So that's obviously places like New York City and Buffalo, but it was also rural, and people didn't realize that New York actually had the third largest rural population in the country at the time.
Wow.
And one thing that's so interesting is we do have this image of a particular rural child as being, white or poor, but there are many Black and brown people who are in rural communities too. And so that's why I love what Jason is doing, because it's twofold. It's one, what you said, which is he's going into some, maybe white rural communities that haven't seen a Black man writing these beautiful poems and novels and everything. And then he's also going into places where there are going to be rural places where there are Black and brown kids who also probably have never gotten to have this experience of this incredible writer. And Jewell, it was what you're saying, your junior year, when you finally got to read this, Jason's giving that to so many kids now. So that's one of the many cool things about him.
Yes. Thank you for
in us and all our other fellow writers of color and what have you, all of us. So I think I blame everybody. Everybody's my kin. All of us as young author writers, we are making a difference. But yes, Jason's spectacular.
Yeah, that's such a strong, I think there's such an appetite for books by people of color right now too. Like working in the bookstore, it's, we've always cared a lot about representation and diversity, and the customers are really looking for it too. I think especially after everything with last year, people are kind of waking up, and they're like, wait, I need to know more about, people that don't look like me, people that are from this place, that place, having this experience and learning stuff. And I just learned more about rural, communities, because it's like, there's always more to like kind of break down in order to rebuild it. Like my image of what it means if you're rural, like how to kind of know more about who we share this country with and who we share this world with. And it's just, you guys are just incredible. And I know that, the book landscape still has a long way to go with the representation and the gatekeeping and everything. But you're both writing about Black and brown kids starring in their own adventures, and Jason's doing that too, and some people are doing that. What would you two like to see more of in this area in the next few years? Like things like that ambassadorship, or is there anything that you're kind of watching for in the coming years?
I've never thought about that. And maybe it's because since the pandemic, I've been really very much concerned with my mortality, because of my age. I'm in a high risk group. And so I want to rejoice and celebrate everything that's coming out, but I'm also trying my best to write faster, because I'm a pretty slow writer, because I feel as though I'm running out of time. And I am very much interested in graphic novels, and they're doing a graphic novel of Ghost Boys. So I think that I'd like to see more with Ghost Boys and graphic novels in general. And actually right now, I just finished teaching When Stars Are Scattered, that wonderful graphic novel. So I'm really curious about how that form can really just be everything and explode in a new artistic trend. I remember comic books, but these graphic novels are so much more than that, than what I remember. So write, and maybe more graphic novels.
So I guess personally for me, I'm actually a pretty fast-ish writer. I have
fast. You're super fast.
And I actually was like, I think I would like to have a moment to slow down a little bit. But I guess I write fast because I feel like if the idea is coming to me, I have to do it. So I'm excited to explore middle grade more. I have more my way coming out, and I'm writing the next Miss Marvel comic book series. So I would love to do a graphic novel of one of my books. Every time, I think, Jewell, to what you're saying, graphic novels are so cool because kids right now are just loving them. Like when I go into a bookstore or when I'm in the library, I just see kids like devouring them. And what I think about is so cool is that it's a combination of word and image, right? Yes. And so kids are able to understand a story in multiple ways. Yes. And that also speaks so much to the time we live in now, because the kids are getting, multiple many
inputs.
And I feel like graphic novels are just such a brilliant way to build a love of reading. And I think yes, I was a former English teacher, so I can't say this enough. A love of reading, being able to help foster that in a kid in any way is just so, so important. Like, let kids read what they want. Let kids read what they gravitate towards. Let them just, if they're rereading this one graphic novel 10 times, great. Just give them more graphic novels, just give them something that will build their love of reading. I just think that's so important. And just, I guess on the publishing front, I do think, things have changed dramatically even since when I was in high school. Like, I didn't read in high school I don't think there were any authors of color at all, even in any of our classes. I'm trying to think of of any of the books from that time. I would still like publishing to make more and greater strides. I think our shelves should reflect our world, and they don't yet.
Yes.
And I think in America, one of the things I would love to see is, I'd love to see more books set in, outside of the States. I'd love to see kids being able to read novels that are set in different parts of the world. Or even, writing, I guess I should do this myself, but writing about American kids, like going to other parts of the world and visiting them and interacting, as, learning what it means to not be a tourist, but a traveler, and learning what it means to be a global citizen. So I would love to see a little bit more of that. And I'd love to honestly, I'd love to see authors of color. I think a lot of people feel like, sometimes we have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And for some people, it's 3 times or 4 times as hard. I'd love to see, some of those doors open to authors of color, and I think there's more opportunities that we could have. And part of my job is to hold the door open and to lift my hand out and help people come up. So I hope publishing follows suit.
Beautiful. We have a comment in the chat here that, and that teachers and librarians also have to be encouraged to diversify their offerings and shelves. I think that is a good one. It's maybe, again, it's my naivete, but it's so astonishing when I learned that Jewell hadn't read a Black author till junior year of college, and it just kind of blew my mind. And maybe that means, a couple a generation removed, that my education had more diverse authors, which is a win. But then it's also like, you wonder, that must be true for so many people.
What's really interesting, when I discovered Black authors, I actually didn't know that I was part of a movement of academics that would actually establish African American studies within the academy, and how that then has trickled down. But both my kids, who are in their 30s now, they both in school read the same Black author and the same Black book. And it was Mildred Taylor's Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which is a wonderful book, but only one. But I got to tell you, more than anything, I write books for teachers and librarians because I think they amplify the power of a book. So anytime somebody uses a book for my classroom, I feel, yes, Towers Falling couldn't have been written if I hadn't thought of how would a teacher teach this? What would be the interdisciplinary connections that they make? And very often you'll find references to other teachers or librarians, like it's a librarian in Ghost Boys who actually introduces Sarah, the white daughter of the white police officer, okay, that's redundant, to some of the civil rights history, so I'm always trying to honor teachers and librarians because they can open the world. And for teachers and librarians who feel uncomfortable sharing diverse material, I find sometimes they feel uncomfortable because they feel shy about, maybe overstepping or speaking for a cultural group that they actually aren't a part of. And I just want to say, stop it, please, because you are part of the greatest cultural group, humanity. And we are all together. We're all sisters and brothers. So though there are going to be differences, that's true of anything. So don't hesitate. But there was a time in the 1960s when it was very difficult for a lot of white allies to speak up, that there was a lot of pushback. And I think we are growing beyond that. So if you feel uncomfortable, get over it and be comfortable, because human beings are human beings are human beings.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a high school teacher. And so one of the things, I actually love talking to teacher groups. I love it, like NCTE or any of these other, it's like one of my favorite things, because I was literally a classroom teacher. And one of the things I like to tell teachers and librarians in schools is that you actually have an incredible amount of power.
Yes.
Like you have this superpower, which is that you get to curate what's going to be on your shelves.
Wow.
Like you have the power to bring a world beyond the walls of your school to your kids. And don't be scared of your power.
Yes, that's good.
I just think that's so important. And I also I mean, honestly, I'm sure my old principals were like, she was a giant pain in the butt, because I really believe in, I think that if you see something that's not right, it's your job to challenge it in the school. And, you know, I think sometimes there's a lot of talk about multiculturalism and diversity, but you have to walk the walk. You have to have those books on your shelves. You have to be teaching them. You have to maybe step back and learn some things yourself. And that discomfort, you know, I believe that you have to lean into that discomfort, because so many of our kids are like uncomfortable every day because of the world they're living in, and are made to feel uncomfortable because of all the people around them. So, you know, as adults, it's our job to, you know, not run away because it's an uncomfortable situation, but to face it and to bring something better to our kids. So yeah, I mean, teachers and librarians, if you're listening, I'm 100% behind you. Use your power.
Also, Ryan put in the chat that teachers and librarians need to stand up to book bans. Having had a couple of my books banned and ongoing, gosh, it is tough out there that a teacher and a librarian has to take, you know, comments from the Department of Police chief, the school board, parents, you know, who are really saying no to diversity. That is a really tough position, you know, and I really do think that maybe through the ACLU, the teachers union, we have to make sure that teachers and librarians don't receive retaliation for just trying to do their job well.
Yeah. I mean, there was just this, I don't know if you saw, Jewell, I'm sure you probably saw that in York, Pennsylvania, the school board had recently banned I mean, I couldn't even, it was literally hundreds of books.
I mean, wow.
And it got, as Ryan said, I was just going to say, it got reversed. And part of the reason that it got reversed is because young people banded, you know, rose up, you know, got the adults in on the protest, went to the school board meeting. They created social media profiles, and they really put a lot of pressure on. And now they're like, okay, we won, but it's not the end. It's just, we have to continue. And I just think that those young people were amazing. But I think librarians have always, like, I remember when the USA Patriot Act came down, and it was like going where librarians were then supposed to tell on, essentially, or report on what certain, you know, certain members of the community were checking out. And you can imagine, like, as right after 9/11, I was one of those people that was going to get like what is she checking out? And so many librarians stood up. I mean, it's against that. And it really just takes a lot of courage. And, you know, so many teachers and librarians are standing up and doing the right thing. So my hat's off to them. And I hope more can join in. You know, you're doing something amazing for kids.
Totally. Thank you so much. This is such a robust conversation, and so many amazing pieces of it that come together. So thank you so much for all of that. Yeah, and I remember when I know the Santa Cruz librarians stood up to the Patriot Act, and what an impression that made on me as a young adult, you know, and that power can be, you know, the quiet people can have such power, you know?
Yes.
So I love that. Well, I'm loving this conversation. I do want to turn also to talk about each of the books we're celebrating tonight a little bit further. So maybe we can turn things over to Jewell for a moment, and you can tell us a little bit more about Paradise on Fire.
I'll just take a few moments. All right. Paradise on Fire was actually inspired by the Paradise Fire, but all the blazes that have been in the West, and particularly in California. I experienced, you know, the sickening danger of it, as well as the pollution of it. And I know that because of climate change and global warming, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So my book is actually a shout out and a call, not only to kids regarding social justice, but also regarding climate change. So my story is about Addie, and her real name is Adago, which means in Nigerian, daughter of an eagle. And her background is that she had an incident where her mother and father were killed by fire when she was a little girl, and she can't quite remember how she escaped. But Addie has been raised by her grandmother, and grandmother has decided that she's going to send her on a wilderness camp adventure. In fact, she's going to go with 6 other inner city kids from the East Coast. They fly to California, and Addie discovers that her skill at maps and maze making is going to be critical to her survival. That Addie is one of those kids who has that abilities to see in 3D, that has aerial perception. And in fact, this is a real intelligence that our schools often don't give enough attention to. We talk about, mathematical learning and, word literacy learning, but being able to visualize in your mind is the sort of bulwark for architects, engineers, and as Addie discovers, climate engineers or climatologists. And so she learns new skills about how to be in the wild, finds out she's good at camping, good at bouldering, good at hiking. And when the moment happens that the wildfire begins, it is Addie who will save some, not all of her friends, by relying upon her inner strength, her sense of the landscape, cartography, topography, and actually makes a commitment to help healing the planet, healing nature. I think that one of the things that scares me most is that as an inner city kid, I grew up not knowing how to swim because there weren't any, swimming pools in my neighborhood. I didn't know about hiking or bouldering or, going river rafting, none of that stuff. I lived in a desert where trees were not very visible. And in consequence, we were subject to even greater, heat strobes than if we were living in a wealthier community that had plenty of tree cover. So how do all children, including those who are not, say, living in California, come to care about the planet, to care about nature if they've never experienced it? So there's actually a group called City Kids Wilderness in DC that takes Black kids to the wilderness in Wyoming to learn about nature and how it can help them in mirror, their inner confidence. And I actually got a chance to meet these students at a conference. And it's like, what are these Black kids doing in Wyoming? Because I had been there often and I had never seen anybody who looked like me. And so that became the spark for this novel, opening oneself to nature, affirming one's own abilities, particularly in 3D and visuals, maps and mazes, and becoming a champion for this planet. So that's Paradise on Fire.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I have some more questions for you, but maybe we'll turn to Samira so we can hear a little bit. Yeah, let's hear a little bit about.
Mirror Helms of the War to Save the World is my middle grade and fantasy debut. Middle grade is a new age group for me, and fantasy is a new genre for me. And I think a lot of people were like, how did you get from like your contemporary books to this? Like, it's such a departure for you. And the thing is, when I was a little girl, in my parents' backyard, there was a small lilac grove where the trees grew together at the top to form a canopy. And in the spring, they were just in full bloom, and they were incredibly fragrant, those like Midwestern beautiful lilacs in spring. And I had this magical ball, a little golden ball. It was really just a rubber ball with gold flecks in it. And when I loved reading, and I was just a kid who loved fantasy. Like, I loved A Wrinkle in Time, and I loved these cool things, but it was never really, I love those stories, but they were never exactly for me. The kids didn't exactly look like me. The kids didn't have my experience. They didn't eat my foods. They didn't have any cultural similarities, but I still thought these adventures were cool. So I would take that little ball and I would throw it into this lilac grove because I imagined that grove to be a magical portal. And in this portal, I could enter just as like a regular kid, and then I would exit as this cool buddy, which is like an Indian fairy, who was a swashbuckler and would battle jinn and devs and ghouls and like the kind of the monsters that were in some of the tales that I was hearing that came from my grandmother, my great grandmother, and my grandmother, and my mom. So I guess at the very heart of this, I sort of wrote this book for that little kid. And then for all the little kids who were like, I want to go on this cool adventure and I want to maybe save the world. And maybe the chosen one is me. And maybe I'm just going to choose myself. And so Amira and Hamza are these kind of two bickering siblings. And one is a little bit nerdier than the other. And one is like just this, he's like in the fandoms and loves Marvel and Star Wars. And on this night of this incredible eclipse of a very rare super blue blood moon, they're at this really cool astronomy exhibit on medieval Islamic astronomy. And it's also an eclipse viewing party. And while they're there, the brother and sister are bickering over this incredible device. It's called a box of the moon by Al-Biruni. It was actually this device is actually something that was actually designed by this polymath Al-Biruni centuries ago. And I fictionalized it a little bit for my book, but I have the little brother who is just always getting into things and never, any button that is in front of him, he's going to press. And he picks this gadget up, and as he and his sister sort of get in tug of war, where she's like the good kid, the studious one who's like, well, we've got to follow the rules. The box sort of comes alive, and when they rush to go tell their parents what's happening, they arrive on the roof of this eclipse viewing party, and everyone around them has fainted. All the adults, everyone there is unconscious. And they run to the street and everyone there is unconscious. And they look up in the sky and a piece of the moon has broken apart and is drifting towards Earth. And then, as if things could not get bad enough, suddenly an army of jinn appear in front of them and say, you are the chosen ones and must come to Kaf, this fantastical land of all these, fire spirits, because you have to end a civil war there, a great battle that's being waged. Otherwise, the entire moon is going to break apart and monsters are going to be unleashed on Earth. So, average day for a middle grader. And, that's how Amira and Hamza start.
That's funny. That's funny. Carol, I wanted to say that I wish I could be there. I'll have to probably log on for Gary Paulsen, because I know there's this, I love wonderful fantasy too. And Samira, your book is fantastic. But Paradise on Fire, I have to give a nod to the Hatchet series by Gary Paulsen, except this time, instead of a young white boy who's just alone, I actually, have this Black girl who's with a community of other Black kids who survived. But I had some of my most fondest memories listening to the Gary Paulsen Hatchet series on audio with my kids. And if you haven't heard the audio of that, I can't think of the actor right now. He's fabulous. Peter Coyote. Yeah. It was a time when we were in the car coming home from school and none of us got out of the car when I got into the garage because we were listening to Peter Coyote telling the Gary Paulsen story. Wow. So I gotta say, I really was trying to write a realistic adventure story, survival story for kids.
Amazing. Well, we'll have to definitely, I'll look for you in that event.
Yeah.
And I definitely got Hatchet vibes when I was reading Paradise on Fire. So that definitely checks out for me. And Samira, I wanted to ask a quick follow-up question to you too, because earlier you had mentioned in the green room, you had mentioned that your kids were your kind of first readers. And I was wondering if they had any input into like, oh, can you make them do this or that? Did they impact the plot at all?
I am not personally good at middle grade jokes, but middle graders are good at middle grade jokes and middle grade puns. And I was just saying to Jewell, I think what's great about middle grade is that kids will just be very blatant and candid. And if something's not good, they will tell you. So yes, I read, they are the earliest readers and they love giving comments, many of which are good. They would actually be pretty good editors.
That's great.
And sometimes I'll ask them, like, I need a pun around this. So it's free labor.
Well, you're feeding and clothing them.
That's true.
Exchange going on here.
That's true, but it's actually delightful to be able to just brainstorm and talk to them about this, because like I said, young kids have their minds are so incredibly just fertile and just bursting with ideas.
Wow. So cool. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left. I wish I could spend a whole nother hour with both of you. But let's turn to a couple of audience questions that have come in. And a reminder, we can probably get to a couple more in case anyone has one that they're burning to ask. You can pop those into the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. We have a question here from Ryan who asks, do you think writing for kids has changed given how crisis heavy the world is? And do you think it's the same with how you've written even during less intense eras? So maybe how has your writing changed given the state right now of the world?
My writing has always been about pretty heavy things. I started writing out trying to make a praise song to African American culture and the struggle and resilience of that community. And also I grew up during the feminism movement, so gender equality is very important to me. So actually, and then class and religion. So I actually find that the things that I was writing about as an adult, 40 years ago in my first novel, I'm writing the same thing for kids, except the challenge is to find a way to say it, that makes it communicate to them and where they're at, and gives them the sort of the hope as well as the knowledge about how to be in a very complicated world. But historically, in terms of children's literature, there's a book, a short guide to children's literature that's published by the Oxford University Press. And it actually talks about how, children's literature used to be there to teach morals, or it was, children's literature was really for the adults, what they wanted to say, to the kids, and that the children's literature, always had to have a happy ending, always had to have these certain features of a home is the good place, and then still have the gender stereotypes. And it's really interesting because it's not until literally, in the 20th century that things started to change, where it started to say, oh, what is the world that they live in? And that children really are old enough and smart enough to understand and the world around them. And we should start writing about that. So the kind of writing that we're doing now is relatively recent in the history of children's literature.
Cool. What about you, Samira? Any changes that you've noticed in writing or in your own or writing that you've read?
Well, I mean, I have only been writing for a few years. So I've only been an author for a few years. So I've always kind of been writing in this time and in this era. And I was teaching in this time too. So I feel like, I do, sometimes I get asked questions about like, why you deal with a lot of tough topics. And even in Amira Hamza, there are some tough things that happen, but I think kids have always had to deal with that. Like kids are always put in those positions. It's not something new. Maybe it's something we're talking about more. And of course, because we're coming in this world, we're like in this terrible pandemic. We have come off of, 4 years of some incredibly terrifying moments in this country. And I do think it's important for literature, for young people to address that. But it's true, when I was a kid growing up, in the 80s, there wasn't really young adult fiction in the way there is now. There was definitely some, but we were, I think the first sort of non-moralistic, because, there was the kind of what Jewell was talking about, like those sort of ABC after school special books, like where at the end, it's like, Johnny was smoking and it's bad to smoke and you shouldn't smoke, those. You're like, okay, but I think, that's why Judy Blume was being read. She was writing before I was a teenager, but that's why we were still reading that book, reading her books, because it spoke to something, it spoke to the intelligence of teens and just like life experiences that they were going through. But I just am so happy that right now there's just such a variety of things that kids can read. And, sometimes, like fiction helps us deal with things like in ourselves too. And even like sometimes the lighter rom-coms or, romances still have things like young people are grappling with, because young love can be difficult.
Yeah.
I
just wanted to add just real quick, that S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders was considered sort of like the mark where the birth of YA literature sort of started to flourish in America. And that novel was published in 1967. And I was just looking on my computer. I did not realize that S.E. Hinton was 16 at the time when that book was published. So it might very well be that what we now know as young adult literature was begun by a young teen, a young adult. I think that's great.
That's amazing. Wow.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's the age your daughter was when she published her first book too, right?
Actually, she was a little bit younger.
Oh, okay.
A little bit younger, and actually we used to lie and make her older, because actually she wrote it the summer after 7th grade. And said, "Here, want to read my novel?" And we went, "Whoa!" And that novel was called Doormat and was published by Random House. And one of the interesting things, Samira and I, we had the same editor at Little Brown, and my daughter, who is Kelly McWilliams, and she wrote Agnes at the End of the World, which is a pandemic novel. But she didn't know a pandemic was going to happen. And she has a novel coming out called Mirror Girls. We all share the same editor, Alvina Ling, at Little Brown Books for Young Readers. And I must give props to Alvina Ling and to Little Brown, because they really do walk the walk, talk the talk, and really promote diverse authors. They are just an absolute wonderful house. That its commitment is not just because it's in or it's going to make money or whatever, that the commitment has always been there. And we need more companies like that.
Yeah, I mean, I love being at Little Brown too. And I think part of it is also that, I'm Asian, and it's pretty cool to be able to have an Asian editor who has an editorial assistant who is Muslim. And I just love the experience of not having to explain something that I've written. And I know many of my colleagues, writers sometimes have to do that. And it's really just wonderful to work in a place that, wants to foster that both in their list, but also with the people that they're hiring and how they work with their authors. I think it's really, it's wonderful. So thanks for giving them a shout out. Alvina's wonderful to work with, and so is the whole team.
That's awesome. Okay, we have time for this one last question. Thanks for sharing about your work, both of you. Patricia is asking, what do you two do when you get stuck? I always love asking fellow authors this, and thank you for your beautiful books. Do you have any writerly advice?
I'll be happy to answer it. And it's kind of crazy, but I don't get stuck. I mean, seriously.
Jinx yourself. Don't say that.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I mean, it's like you can slap me if you want. No, but it's like I don't get stuck. Some of my ideas, like if you've read Black Brother, the whole idea of Alexander Dumas, the Black author, that came from something that I learned about when I was like 25, that sometimes my stories have long gestation periods, long origins. And sometimes I dream them. When I'm waking up in bed, I'll have like the first page in my mind, or when I'm walking the dogs. And I think in terms of how I approach novel writing is that, it's basically everything is brewing in my soul all the time. So no, I don't get stuck. It's just a matter of when it's ready to be born. And I've had stories that taken, years to be born, stories that have just streamed out of me, but I think for me, when I used to think about being stuck, and I used to think about also in particular books about writers who could write 8 hours a day, who were always, when I was reading them, men who had wives who did everything, I would end up making myself feel bad. Because one, I either didn't write long enough, I didn't write hard enough, something must be wrong with me because my mind wandered. And the moment that I just said hogwash and got rid of that and became much more at ease, that I'm writing all the time, even when I'm not at a computer, that my soul is putting and clicking and making connections, so that when the story comes out, that's when it comes out. So I don't get stuck by sort of mental choice. And I think that's been healthier for me, that I end up getting it done.
Okay, so when we were talking earlier, Jewell and I realized that we have some similar approaches to our books, like especially at the end of the book. And I have to say that I also don't believe in writer's block for me.
Yeah.
I don't acknowledge its existence, I guess. I don't know, maybe that helps. But I think, a lot of times when people ask me for writing advice, I always say the best advice is to know yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you know yourself, then you'll understand the method that's going to work for you. And so for me, because there's a lot of books out there, just like Jewell was saying, and I think sometimes you can get like in this mindset where it's like, okay, well, I've got to do it this way, but you don't have to do it that way. You can do it whatever way you want to. And I think there's freedom in knowing that and knowing what works for you. And sometimes that's going to be trial and error. And, one of the things with writing my first book, your first book is always, or at least usually it's the longest because you have no deadline. And you don't even have an agent probably. And so you're taking a very long time to write it. And I honestly didn't even know how to write a book because I was like 40 and I was like, I think I want to write a book. So it wasn't, I had different careers and I was literally Googling like, how do you write a book? But so one of the things through that sort of trial and error that I found that works for me is that anytime I have an idea for a story that I think is going to work, I actually write a short story first.
Wow.
So I take the characters, and it's not a short story that encompasses the entire arc of the novel. It's like a vignette almost with the main character and maybe one or two side characters in that world. And I write that short story or that vignette, and then I figure out, does this story have legs? Is it a place I want to live for, 18 months or 2 years and 80,000 words or however many it is? And, you got to read it so many times, and am I going to get sick of it? Like, on the second read or on the 10th read, when is that going to happen? So writing that short story is something that really helps me. And then I just have my notebooks. And sometimes, like right now, I have 3 story ideas I'm kind of working on. And sometimes I set it aside. So I don't think of that as stuck because I'm working on other, working on other ideas. And I have a notebook for each story idea. And sometimes even just in my phone, I might see an image or hear something, and then I quickly will jot something down that I later transfer to the notebook. So I guess it's like an organic process a little bit. And then, I guess I don't acknowledge writer's block, so it doesn't acknowledge me. I don't know.
That's wonderful. Wow. I love the similarities between the two of you and your writing styles and your, just the combination tonight. This conversation has been just brilliant. I've really enjoyed every minute of it, and I know our audience has too. So thank you both so much. I'm going to reach and grab your books so I can hold them up for the camera. You can see how beautiful they are. Amira and Hamza out yesterday. It's so gorgeous.
Yes.
Paradise on Fire. We have signed books for this one. Absolutely gorgeous. So definitely don't miss out on adding these to your shelves. You can click buy the books in the link below. A reminder that this event has been recorded. You can share it with your friends. It's at the same link where you watched it tonight. So it's right here on this page. And Jewell and Samira, I just really hope we can welcome you into the store in person someday.
It would be wonderful. Yes.
I would love that. Yes, that would be great.
To get together and thank you for the pairing with Samira. We didn't have a chance to always get to have a conversation, and I feel as though, whoa, we have so much more in common that I never knew about.
I know. We definitely have to have a date. We definitely have to make a date in person when we can all be safely together.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I feel with both of you, okay, girlfriend moment. Girl, yes, yeah. So you've been actually gracious, Carol, as as the moderator and panelist. So give our thanks to Bookshop Cruz and Santa Cruz, and anyway, I'm just
and support indie bookstores. Yay!
Yes, thank you so much. Yay, indies! So we wouldn't be here without you. So thank you so much for supporting us, and thank you for the shout outs and the love and our gracious audience. And I hope to see you down the road before too long. And have a great
Thank you, and thank you, audience. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Both.